Hey everybody, and welcome to Dominion Cards. This is a video series where we take a strategic, in-depth look at various cards from the board game Dominion. Today we're looking at Harbinger. This is a 3-cost action card from the 2nd edition base game, and it says, +1 card, +1 action, look through your discard pile, you may put a card from it onto your deck. So Harbinger is a card that's got a lot of problems. There are 3 problems that you need to be able to manage and deal with before Harbinger is a card that's actually doing quite a lot for you. It is worth noting that this is a cantrip, +1 card, +1 action, and if you have no discard pile or you choose not to put a card from your discard pile onto your deck, then it is what we call a do-nothing cantrip, right? All you got from the card was +1 card, +1 action. That just means the card replaced itself in your deck, and while that doesn't hurt you, right, it's okay if Harbinger sometimes doesn't do anything for you. If the card is never doing anything for you, and it's always a do-nothing cantrip, then, except under special circumstances, why is this card in your deck? You don't sort of win the game by adding in cards that do nothing for you, right? So the first problem that we have is that you need to have a discard pile for Harbinger to actually be able to do anything. So the sort of deck that you normally look to build every time it's possible to do so in Dominion is one where you draw all of your cards every turn. And when that happens, you usually don't have a discard pile. So if you have drawn all of your cards on your turn, then you start every turn from a clean shuffle, which means that you've just shuffled at the end of your last turn, and so now you don't have anything in your discard. It is worth noting that Harbinger draws first, so if you have nothing in your draw pile at all, even if you have something in your discard, you will trigger a shuffle before you get the chance to activate the effect. So again, it doesn't do anything in that case. So as long as you end your turn with 0 to 4 cards left in the draw pile, you will be shuffling at the end of your turn. But even if you have 5 cards left in your deck, you will not shuffle at the end of your turn. But if you try and play a Harbinger as the first card on your next turn, you will immediately trigger a shuffle, and so you won't actually get a chance to use its effect. So Harbinger has real challenges in some of the most powerful decks that you can build, and that you simply just don't have a discard pile, so it's not doing anything for you. So that's a big problem for Harbinger, and this is like the most important problem in a way. If it's no good in the most powerful decks, then it's not going to really be a very good card, and that's the case for Harbinger overall. It's pretty weak because of this problem of it just not working in the sorts of decks that you usually want to build. And the second problem is that let's say you do have a discard pile. Well, you're going to need to have good cards that are worth top decking inside that discard pile. So let's imagine that you are forced to discard a card. You could have been hit by a militia, or maybe you have poachers in your hand and you've got to discard. Well, normally when you've got to discard a card, you would pick the worst card to discard from your hand. So if you're hit with a militia and you've got a copper and an estate in your hand, you will choose to discard those, and then you've got cards in your discard that you don't actually want to top deck, in which case, even if you play a Harbinger, you'll choose not to top deck anything, and it's not done anything for you. Now, the exception case tends to be if you aren't drawing your deck and you're taking multiple turns to run through a shuffle, then you have all of the contents of your previous turns and the cards that you bought from those previous turns in your discard pile, and that's sort of a case where you will have good cards to pick up and put on top of your deck. So people normally, first of all, think of Harbinger as being a sort of card that you would play in the sorts of decks where you can't draw your deck, which are already pretty weak anyway. So, that's saying that Harbinger's a weak card. Only if the board is weak does Harbinger get a look in, which is kind of true, really. Now, you can sometimes get a card into your discard pile in the middle of your action phase because you have a card like Workshop that is gaining cards in the middle of your turn. So what you can do is, say you start as your turn and you've got 3 villages and a workshop in your hand, and it's I don't know if I'm going to find a smithy. You could play a village, play the workshop, put the card into your smithy into your discard, then if you have a Harbinger, you can play it, put the smithy on top, play another village, and then you've got this smithy, and you've just sort of guaranteed that you got one. But bear in mind, that was a lot of card plays to do something like that. Because Harbinger puts the card on top of your deck instead of directly into your hand, you do actually need to play some other card in order to draw it off of the top of your deck. So even if you have a Harbinger, you may sometimes find that you can top deck the card that you want, but you can't actually play it this turn because you have nothing left in your hand that can draw. So you need Harbinger to have either more Harbingers or other draw cards to get at the card that you want, even if you did have a discard pile and a good card in your discard pile. So sometimes there are other ways to get good cards into your discard pile. So sometimes you don't actually get to pick what goes in your discard pile. So here are just some examples of cases where this can happen. So Bandit from the base game. Its attack looks at the top 2 cards of your deck, tries to trash a good treasure if one's in there, and then it discards the rest. So sometimes your opponent will play a bandit because they want to get a gold, and a smithy in a village, for example, could be on top of your deck, and now they both end up in the discard. So, this sort of example is a case where it could have discarded bad cards, but it also could have discarded good cards. So you can end up, it could be a problem if all your draw just gets accidentally discarded by your opponent's bandit, and Harbinger can save you from that. So it will allow you to recover that smithy and that village and put it on top of your deck, which can be nice. Advisor from Guilds. This is sort of a lab variant where you reveal the top 3 cards of your deck and your opponent picks the best one, and you have to discard that. So Advisor's really, really good at discarding the best cards in your deck, but you don't want the best cards in your discard pile. So Harbinger combos nicely with Advisor, because with Advisor you usually have a lot of good cards in your discard pile all the time, unless you put them back on top to either draw them or to have another go with Advisor. Generally with Advisor you want it to reveal either a whole load of really bad cards or a whole load of really good cards, so you're still able to draw good cards. And Harbinger allows that to happen. Another example here is Pillage from Dark Ages. This is a discard attack, but is one where your opponent gets to pick the card to discard, and it can completely ruin your turn. Harbinger can sort of try and make Pillage attacks a lot less viable by allowing you to recover the card that they discarded. It's okay in that sort of situation. There are more examples, but these are just some cases where you end up with good cards in your discard. Another thing that can happen is that you are playing cards and you sort of end up with good cards in your discard entirely by accident. So here's another lab variant, Hunting Party. This is from Cornucopia. And it searches through your deck to try and find a copy of a card that you don't already have in your hand, and a whole load of other cards potentially end up in the discard. So Hunting Party can discard good cards if they are a duplicate of a card you have in your hand. It does draw the top card off of your deck first, so with a Harbinger, you could play Hunting Party, have most of your deck discarded, then play Harbinger to put one onto your deck, a good card, and then you play another Hunting Party and it will draw that good card, and then it will go ahead and do its whole hunting, searching and putting cards in your discard. Rebuild from Dark Ages is another example. It hunts for a victory card in your deck and it will just discard everything that it comes across. So one of the big problems with Rebuild is that Rebuild likes to discard all of your other rebuilds, so you don't get to play them, and Harbinger can be nice in that it allows it to skip a rebuild and then you top deck a rebuild either for this turn or for next turn. So you just get to play Rebuild a bit more, and Rebuild is a card that you want to play as much as possible to win, so it can be nice with that. Border Guard here from Renaissance, that will reveal 2 or possibly 3 of the cards from the top of your deck, and you get to pick one and discard the rest. So if Border Guard is finding 2 or 3 really good cards, then unfortunately you're only going to keep one of them, and the others are going to end up in your discard. So Border Guard can sort of accidentally, depending on how it draws, end up putting a load of good cards in the discard, and sometimes Harbinger can be nice to try and recover those sooner than you otherwise would, right? Because any good card in your discard, if you want to draw your deck, it's sort of like having them drawn last, and sometimes you don't want that. Now here's the last third issue for Harbinger, and it's a pretty big one, and that is that in order to use this card at all, you actually have to get a Harbinger into your deck first. And the problem is, because Harbinger is typically so weak, usually there's no good reason to buy it, right? It loses opportunity cost. So silver also costs 3, and silver's not a great card, but there are a lot of cases where silver would probably be better for you than a Harbinger. So what you find is that, Harbinger, a lot of the times when you're only going to buy it, unless there's like a very specific reason to do so in a kingdom, which doesn't happen very often, a lot of the time you will only get a Harbinger because there was literally nothing else that you wanted to get. Right, adding a Harbinger to your deck is often better than adding nothing at all. But, that is, Harbinger itself is a card that often does nothing at all as well. So that's why, it struggles against anything else. So Harbinger has real opportunity cost problems, and that's mainly because it's so weak. There's a lot of boards where even if you do pick one up over nothing, it still won't do anything for you anyway, in which case, it didn't really matter. You can occasionally get some sort of incidental case where Harbinger is doing something for you, but you have to have also had a situation where you wanted to buy a Harbinger first. Bear in mind that while you can always buy a silver instead of a Harbinger, there are a bunch of decks, like decks where you're trying to draw your whole deck, where you actually don't want like a second or a third silver, and so it is better to actually take nothing over silver, and that's the sort of case where you can sort of end up with a Harbinger in your deck when you otherwise wouldn't. Now, let's talk about things like, say you do have a Harbinger, what sort of other things can it do for you? Well, top decking isn't just about drawing a card earlier. It can also be used to try and seed your next turn. So let's imagine that you have a huge amount of draw in your deck, right? So you have, like, for example, more laboratories than you actually intend to play. You just have a lot for reliability purposes. You don't really need them all. If you have that and you have a way to discard cards from your hand, then what you can do is like play a poacher to discard a lab, and then just before you reach the end of your deck, you can play a Harbinger and top deck that lab for next turn, and then you get to start the next turn with a lab guaranteed in your hand, and that's nice for reliability purposes, so you can do that. Moat is another card from the base game, which actually, you need to have that in your starting hand for it to actually do anything in terms of blocking attacks. So it is possible to have engine, like again, you have like one poacher and you're drawing your deck, and you get a chance to play the poacher and discard the moat just before you finish drawing your deck, and then top deck it for next turn. We didn't really mention Harbinger in the moat video as a way to guarantee putting a moat on top of your deck every turn, and that is because, it involves picking up a Harbinger in a deck where you are drawing your deck, and also you need to have a way to discard it as well. So there's a lot that needs to happen in order to get this sort of combo going. So you almost never really see it, even though it's possible. So I didn't really want to bog down the explanation of moat by talking about this, just because it's so rare. And of course, if you want to seed your next turn and you're drawing your deck, the ideal time to play the Harbinger is when you have exactly one card left in your draw pile. So therefore it really helps to be able to creep up to the end of your deck in that way, and so you kind of need other cantrips in your hand to be able to play them. That's sort of, you've got to have real good control of your deck in order to make this particular advantage work, because you want very, very fine control over how close to the end of your deck you can get. So what about like a big money style deck or a treasure based deck? So if you think about a deck where you just like aren't drawing at all, it takes you a while to get through your shuffles, so you're going to have a bunch of turns where you do have all of your previous turns cards in the discard pile. So, is Harbinger good in these situations? You could, for example, theoretically top deck a gold from a previous turn, and so then on your next turn you'll have that gold in it that you played twice, and that sounds pretty good. But bear in mind that this won't happen all the time, even in a deck like this. If the Harbinger happens to be at the very top of your new shuffle, you won't have a discard pile on that turn, so it won't do anything. Similarly, if you get it right at the very end of your deck, then you might trigger a shuffle, or you're going to trigger a shuffle by playing the Harbinger, and again, it won't get to do anything. So Harbinger, even in this sort of deck, you will still get cases where you have no choice but not be able to use it. In addition to that, there is the question that is Harbinger actually better than Silver in these sorts of decks? In these sorts of decks, you're okay to add quite a lot of victory cards, but the reason for that is because you have a high density of useful non-victory cards. So you Silver you kind of want in those sorts of decks. You tend to keep your coppers around. And if you just never get any silvers and you're getting Harbingers instead, then you might find that actually that's worse than just picking up a silver. Even in the occasions where you do get to top deck a gold, you might have been better off just having a silver in your hand on this particular turn. It is drawing you a card and +1 action, but neither of those things are very useful in this kind of deck. The value of drawing one more card is not that great, and the value of +1 action, well, you might not actually have another action to play. So you're getting very, very low value. So Harbinger is an exceptionally weak card overall. It's really, really hard to find situations where it's actually any good and doing anything for you whatsoever. The only reason why Harbinger is not the worst card in the base game is because it doesn't hurt you if it's of no use, and also it has Bureaucrat in it, which is just really, really bad. So that wins. But Harbinger's right down there as one of the worst cards in the game, unfortunately. At least in the base set, it's definitely not one of the worst cards in the game. So what we're going to do is we are going to generate some random boards that have Harbinger in it, and we're going to assess whether it's any good or not. So what's happening here? Well, we've got Chapel, we've got Village, we've got Witch, we've got Militia, we've got Bandit. There's no plus buy. This is a deck where we're going to Chapel down. I think we're going to use Witch. Witch is our only draw, so we're definitely getting it anyway, along with Village. We'll pick up a Workshop to get some Villages. I think you open Chapel Militia, you eventually look to get some Witches, and then you're going to Bandit. You're going to get some golds. Do you bother with Bandit? I guess you do. You'd still take it. Because you have a Workshop, it's possible that you might get a Harbinger in this game, but it's really not doing anything for you. It is very unlikely that you would ever do anything in this kingdom, because you're going to have a very small deck with Chapel that you're going to be able to draw pretty consistently. The card that you're most likely to have in your discard pile at any given time is a Curse that you don't want, and Workshop, you shouldn't really have any problems drawing the card that you gain with Workshop, but you're only really doing that just to get some excess Villages. In fact, maybe Workshop isn't even very good here. You probably don't even bother. Maybe just buy the Villages that you want yourself. Is Artisan better? In which case the card you get goes directly into your hand. You probably don't bother with that either. So anyway, I think Harbinger's completely useless on this board. You just never have a discard pile with anything you want to put in it. Your opponent's Bandit could put like your Witches in there, but I think you just never bother. So what's going on here? So again, we have Chapel Witch, but this time there is no Village. So we're going to trash down with Chapel. We're happy to get an Artisan for Labs. We're only really going to be playing one Witch per turn until it runs out. We're going to be buying golds once we're drawing our deck, so we're going to have a couple of these basic treasures. And eventually at the end of the game, once we stop playing the Witch, we would like a remodel, I suppose. Or maybe an Artisan to just gain duchies directly might be better than a remodel. We're going to have the Artisan anyway. So we're going to Chapel. And I think we have to Witch just to continue to force our opponent to keep playing Chapel to trash the curses so that they can't play Artisan. But I think once all of the curses go, you finally get an opportunity to start playing Artisan. Maybe you take a break, I don't know. But you really want an Artisan and a lot of Labs. Maybe both players just don't bother with the Witch. Your opponent can curse you 4 times until it's worth you taking a turn off to play a Chapel and trash all the curses. So you would rather just be gaining Labs in that time. So I guess Witch is no good here. You certainly never get a Harbinger. When are you ever going to pick it up? There's no buy, and you have much better cards to gain. Eventually, at the end of the game, you might remodel, I don't know, turn your Artisan into a province. But yeah, there's no point in Harbinger on this game. what's happening here? So we have no trashing at all, and we have Witch. So we are going to get clogged down with all sorts of junk. There's going to be so much junk going on in this game. And there's militia attack as well. What do we actually want to do here? I think we open militia and silver. So what could be good here? Actually, Harbinger could have some value here because you can keep top decking your witches and your militias. So you don't need as many because you just cannot draw in this game. You're going to have so much junk and there is no village. You really want to get off one of these 3 attacks as often as possible. And I think because you just want to slam your opponent with these attacks whenever you can, that you're actually going to be buying Harbinger. I think you open with a silver and a militia, but then after that you don't look to buy any more silvers. You would actually rather get Harbingers, and that's just because the card that you get to put back on top of your deck can be so effective in this game, and you want to play it so often. But you have a really, really big deck, so when you buy one of these cards, you never get a chance to play it. But if you can play like a witch 3 times in one shuffle or something, then that's going to be exceptionally good for you. Otherwise, how do we even end this game? There is extra buys. It doesn't feel good to go for gardens, but it's going to be so difficult to hit province when you're being cursed, and then there's discard attacks. And you don't really care for a smithy. Do you just play bandit a lot? I guess you move on to that, you flood your deck with golds, and eventually you try and pick up provinces, but that's so long and slow. I'm just worried that if you go gardens, what's going to empty? You're going to have the curse pile empty. You could eventually empty gardens, but then what else do you empty to actually end the game? If people buy a lot of Harbingers, I can see gardens becoming the thing that you use to actually end the game and get all of your points. So this is sort of the deck where Harbinger's really good just because there's nothing else to do except play some very particular powerful cards as many times as possible, and you cannot build any sort of draw deck to do that. So this is sort of the case where Harbinger has some use for you. And I think it's better than silver in this sort of case. Maybe you don't get too many over silvers, but I think I can see a deck that has a whole bunch of Harbingers. Just you really want to win that curse split, and then you want to gain some golds and discard your opponent and maybe get some gardens and duchies, and maybe you get a province or 2. But very long, slow game where you're really finding it hard to actually shuffle. So Harbinger has opportunities there. What's happening here? So we have Sentry and Moneylender for trashing. You're going to open Moneylender and get up to a Sentry. Either that, you open Remodel, but I think I prefer the Moneylender to get to the Sentry. It's not like the Remodel's going to go into anything super nice. I guess Poacher's okay. And then you're going to look to gain labs and markets. And you've got Bandit, so there is no village, but you will eventually look to play a bandit every turn, gain a load of golds, and then eventually you'll get a remodel, and you will draw up, and you will turn some spare golds at the end of the game into province, and that's sort of how this game's going to go. It's just doing that. I don't think you ever get a Harbinger here. There's no real opportunity to have something in your draw pile because you want to draw your deck every turn anyway, so Harbinger just is a bit useless on this board. It's not doing anything. And now the final one. What have we got here? So this is a festival library, is it? Can we trash down? So we can trash our coppers, leaving us with just 3 estates. And we can festival library, militia. It seems worrying, but not under festival library. It's quite good. And there's no other way to draw. So what we want to do is we want to open... Maybe we don't bother with the militia. Maybe we don't really care to have a militia in our deck. So maybe we start with the trashing straight away with Moneylender, and we open Moneylender Silver, and we start buying festivals and then libraries, and we look to get the festival library engine going. And once that's going, what else do you do? I guess you have a silver, so you could be picking up some merchants as well in that kind of deck. maybe some markets. You should be able to get up to double province and start picking those up, and you're sort of only really going to look to gain combos of like these 4 cards: Moneylender, Library, Festival, Merchant. You're going to have so many action cards that I think your merchants aren't really at risk from getting it silver trashed, but you could always get a second silver. But yeah, so that's what you're doing. Harbinger will have no use here because eventually you're not going to have a discard pile. You can technically put actions in your discard pile with Library, but once your deck is going, you will have no problem drawing those back up again anyway. And you wouldn't skip the cards that you care to have right now in either case. So Harbinger is... maybe you pick one up just because there's nothing to do at some point, but otherwise I don't imagine that Harbinger will ever be picked up here. So there you go, that was Harbinger. As you saw, there was only sort of one deck where it was actually any good, and it was a very particular deck where there was no engine. So Harbinger sort of only really shines on those very weak boards that have something very powerful that you need to play as often as possible, and there's sort of nothing else you want to do with your turn other than play that powerful card. That sort of... yeah, that's kind of one of Harbinger's only real main uses, apart from very specific combos like Advisor. So yeah, it's weak. It's kind of surprising to me that it's a second edition card, because the second edition, got rid of a load of bad cards and then it added in one that's also pretty bad. Just suspected that maybe they would have been a bit better and more useful, but it's not. Harbinger's just very, very weak. Anyway, I hope that was interesting for you. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time. Goodbye.